Have you ever been on a date that started off perfectly normal, only to take an unexpected turn that left you wondering, what just happened? Well, that's exactly what happened to John, a 65-year-old man who thought he was meeting someone special on a blind date. After years of focusing on his career and raising a family, John was ready to find companionship against someone to share quiet dinners, laugh over old memories, and maybe even grow old with. Little did he know, this blind date would become an unforgettable story. At first, everything seemed promising. The conversation flowed, there was mutual respect, and the evening had all the makings of a potential connection. But just as John began to feel hopeful, his date, a seemingly charming 52-year-old woman, revealed something that changed everything. Not one, not two, but 4 unexpected demands that left John completely stunned. What could she have possibly said to make him walk away without looking back? Get ready. Because this story isn't just about a date gone wrong, it's a lesson in knowing your boundaries, standing up for yourself, and realizing that sometimes it's better to walk away than to settle for less than you deserve. John had always considered himself a patient man. At 65, he'd seen life from every angle, raising a family, navigating a long career, and experiencing the bittersweet moments that come with time. But after his retirement, loneliness crept in quietly. His grown kids had their own lives, his days felt longer, and the house felt a little too quiet. That's when his friend suggested something he'd never tried before, a blind date. At first, John hesitated. The idea of meeting a complete stranger at this stage in life felt both exciting and unnerving. But curiosity won. After all, what's the worst that could happen? A coffee, a conversation, maybe a new friend. The day arrived, and John dressed with quiet confidence, a crisp shirt, polished shoes, and the hopeful nerves of a man trying something new. He chose a cozy little cafe in town, the kind with warm lighting and the soft hum of background chatter, just enough to make the atmosphere feel lively without being overwhelming. When he walked in, he spotted her almost instantly. Linda. She was sitting near the window, dressed elegantly, with an air of self-assurance that caught his attention. They exchanged polite smiles as he approached. "Hi. You must be John," she said warmly, standing to greet him. "That's me," he replied with a friendly nod. "And you must be Linda." They settled into their seats, menus in hand, but neither of them seemed too interested in the food. The conversation flowed easily at first. They talked about their past careers, shared light-hearted stories about family, and even laughed at a few relatable getting older jokes. John found himself relaxing, thinking maybe, just maybe, this could be the start of something good. But as the evening unfolded, John noticed something. Linda had a certain way of steering the conversation. It wasn't just about getting to know each other, it felt like she was subtly setting the stage for something more specific. She leaned forward, her expression serious, and said, "John, I believe in being upfront. I don't like wasting time, and I'm sure you don't either." John nodded slowly, sensing a shift in the air. "I appreciate honesty," he replied. "That's good," she said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Because there are a few things I need to be clear about if we're going to continue seeing each other." John raised an eyebrow, intrigued but cautious. "A few things?" he thought. "All right, let's hear them." What he didn't know was that her next words would completely change the course of the evening, and not in the way he expected. John leaned back slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. He'd been on dates before, but never one where someone was this direct, this early. "All right," he thought. "Let's hear what she has to say." Linda adjusted her posture, her expression a mix of confidence and seriousness, as if she were about to negotiate a business deal rather than continue a casual date. She placed her cup down with a soft clink and began. "First," she said, "if we're going to date, I expect you to provide financial support not just for me, but for my grown children." John blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. Financial support? For her adult kids? This wasn't what he had anticipated. Linda elaborated, explaining that her children were finding themselves and needed assistance with things like rent, car payments, and occasional vacations. She spoke as if this was the most natural expectation in the world. John felt a tightness in his chest, not from anger, but from disbelief. Is this a partnership or a sponsorship? He wondered. He didn't interrupt, though. He wanted to hear her out completely. Linda didn't wait for a reaction. She moved on to her second point, her tone unwavering. Second, she continued, I don't want you to have close friendships with other women, whether they're old friends, neighbors, or even colleagues from your past. Emotional connections with other women are off limits. This hit John differently. He'd always believed that trust was the foundation of any relationship, especially at their age when life's experiences had taught them the value of genuine connections. He thought of his longtime friend Susan, who had been a colleague for over 20 years and had supported him through tough times. Is friendship now a threat? He thought. This wasn't about respect. It felt more like control. But Linda wasn't finished. She leaned in slightly, as if what she was about to say next was even more crucial. Third, she said firmly, I expect us to spend holidays only with my family. I'm not interested in splitting time or visiting your kids or grandkids. My family will be our priority. John felt the weight of her words settle in. His family was everything to him. Sunday dinners with his daughter, fishing trips with his grandson, holiday traditions that had spanned decades. Were these supposed to be optional now? How could she expect me to turn my back on that? He thought. Despite the growing discomfort, John kept his composure. He didn't want to cause a scene in the cafe. Maybe, just maybe, her final point would shift things back into neutral ground. But then came the fourth and final demand. Lastly, Linda said, her voice softer but no less firm, I don't plan on contributing to household chores or cooking. At this point in my life, I believe a man should take care of those responsibilities if he wants companionship. John stared at her, processing everything. Not contributing to the partnership, not emotionally, not practically, not even with shared life responsibilities. He wasn't looking for a maid or a servant, of course. He was looking for a companion, a partner, someone to share life's joys and burdens equally. For a brief moment, there was silence between them. Linda sat back, clearly confident in what she'd laid out, as if expecting John to nod and agree without hesitation. But instead, John smiled politely, placed his napkin on the table, and stood up. Linda, he said gently, I appreciate your honesty. Really, I do. But it's clear we're looking for very different things. She looked surprised, perhaps expecting him to negotiate or argue. But John didn't owe her an explanation beyond that. He wished her well, paid for his coffee, and walked out the door with a sense of clarity he hadn't felt in a long time. As John stepped out into the cool evening air, he didn't feel disappointed. In fact, he felt liberated. That blind date wasn't a failure, it was a revelation. He realized something powerful. When you know your worth, walking away isn't a loss, it's self-respect. In life, especially as we get older, it's easy to feel pressured into accepting situations or relationships that don't align with our values. Loneliness can make us settle. Fear of starting over can make us compromise. But John's story teaches us that it's okay to say no. It's okay to walk away from people who see relationships as transactions rather than partnerships. Love, companionship, and respect, they're not things you demand. They're things you build, together, with mutual understanding and effort. John's story isn't just about a date gone wrong. It's about the importance of boundaries, the courage to stand up for what matters, and the wisdom to know when to leave. So, the next time you find yourself in a situation where you're asked to sacrifice your values, your family, or your peace of mind, remember John. Remember that sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand up, smile, and walk away. As John stepped out of the cafe, the crisp noon breeze felt like a quiet companion, soothing the whirlwind of thoughts racing through his mind. But instead of feeling embarrassed or regretful about the abrupt end to his blind date, he felt surprisingly liberated. It was as if walking away from that table wasn't just about leaving a conversation, it was about stepping into a clearer understanding of himself. John had always been a kind-hearted man, the type who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. Throughout his life, he'd often bent over backward to make relationships work, thinking compromise was the foundation of love. But today's encounter with the 52-year-old woman, her rigid demands, her transactional view of companionship, shook something loose within him. Realizing the power of boundaries, for the first time in years, John recognized the importance of boundaries. Her list of demands wasn't just unreasonable. It was a reflection of someone who viewed relationships through the lens of control rather than connection. And for too long, John had been in situations where he ignored his own needs to meet others' expectations. Walking away from that cafe was his silent declaration. I know my worth. He realized that relationships shouldn't feel like negotiations or business contracts. They should be rooted in mutual respect, understanding, and acceptance, a checklist of requirements to be met. Companionship, especially later in life, should bring peace and joy, not pressure and demands. A shift in perspective. As John strolled through the park, watching children play and couples enjoy simple moments together, he reflected on what he truly wanted. It wasn't about finding someone to fit into a mold or meet specific criteria. It was about genuine connection, someone who could sit quietly with him, share a laugh over an inside joke, or simply enjoy a walk without expectations hanging in the air. He thought about the years he'd spent worrying about being alone, believing that being single at 65 was a sign of failure. But today, he saw it differently. Being single didn't mean he was incomplete. It meant he had the freedom to choose wisely, to wait for someone who valued him for who he was, not for what he could provide. Finding peace in solitude. By the time John reached home, he felt lighter, not because he had found love, but because he had found clarity. That blind date wasn't a failure. It was a lesson in self-respect, in recognizing red flags early, and in understanding that walking away isn't a sign of weakness. It's a testament to strength. John made himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and smiled. He didn't need someone to validate his worth. He had done that himself, simply by choosing to walk away. And in that choice, he discovered something far more valuable than a fleeting romance. He found peace within. In the days that followed, John often found himself reflecting on that blind date, not with bitterness, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. It's strange how the smallest moments can leave the biggest imprints on our lives. That brief meeting, filled with awkward pauses and unmet expectations, turned out to be more enlightening than he could have ever anticipated. Lesson 1. Red flags are warnings, not challenges. For most of his life, John had been someone who believed in second chances. He thought that with patience, understanding, and effort, any relationship could be salvaged. But that date taught him something crucial. Red flags aren't challenges to overcome, they're warnings to heed. When someone reveals who they are through rigid demands, lack of respect, or entitlement, it's not your job to change them. It's your cue to move on. John realized that many people ignore these signs early on, hoping things will improve. But ignoring red flags only leads to deeper frustrations down the line. His swift exit from that date wasn't an act of rudeness, it was self-preservation. Lesson 2. Relationships should add peace, not pressure. As John sat alone in his favorite park, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he reflected on past relationships. Some were filled with constant compromises, emotional negotiations, and walking on eggshells. That blind date felt like a preview of what his life could have been if he had settled a life filled with demands, expectations, and conditional affection. But relationships aren't supposed to feel like that. They should feel like coming home in it, walking into a courtroom. A partner should bring out the best in you, not drain you with ultimatums disguised as standards. Love isn't about ticking boxes. It's about embracing imperfections and finding joy in the ordinary. Lesson 3. It's okay to choose yourself. For years, John thought that being alone meant being lonely. But after that date, he discovered the beauty of solitude. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude. Feels like emptiness. The other feels like freedom. By walking away, John chose himself. And that simple act, choosing peace over pretense, felt empowering. He realized he didn't need a partner to validate his existence. His worth wasn't tied to someone's approval or a relationship status. Self-respect is the highest form of love. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself. A new chapter begins. Months later, John found himself back at that same café for a date, but to meet an old friend. He smiled, remembering how he once felt anxious about being alone. But now, he walked in with confidence, knowing that he'd rather wait for something real than settle for something convenient. That blind date wasn't the start of a new romance, but it was the beginning of a new chapter in John's life, one filled with clarity, self-respect, and the courage to walk away when something doesn't feel right. And sometimes, that's the greatest love story of all. John's decision to walk away from that blind date wasn't just an impulsive reaction, it was a defining moment that reshaped his perspective on relationships and self-worth. Often, people feel obligated to endure uncomfortable situations for the sake of politeness, societal expectations, or fear of loneliness. But there's profound strength in recognizing when something isn't right and having the courage to walk away. Lesson 4. You don't owe anyone your time or energy. For years, John believed that once you commit to meeting someone, you should see it through, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. But that blind date shattered that belief. He realized that respecting someone else's time doesn't mean you should disrespect your own. When you find yourself in a situation where you're not valued or where your presence feels like a mere transaction, it's okay to leave. Walking away doesn't make you rude or heartless. It means you're honoring your feelings, boundaries, and peace of mind. John learned that you don't owe. Walking away doesn't make you rude or heartless. It means you're honoring your feelings, boundaries, and peace of mind. John learned that you don't owe anyone endless explanations, especially when their actions speak louder than words. Your time and energy are precious, and it's perfectly acceptable to protect them. The freedom that comes with self-awareness. After the date, John felt an unexpected sense of liberation. He wasn't weighed down by the usual post-date anxieties. Did I say the right thing? Should I have stayed longer? Instead, he felt light, free, and in control. That's the thing about self-awareness, it gives you clarity. When you know your values, your deal breakers, and what truly matters to you, making decisions becomes easier. John's clarity didn't come from reading books or watching motivational videos. It came from lived experience. He had spent years compromising, adjusting, and shrinking himself to fit into relationships that weren't meant for him. But not anymore. That date taught him that the right person will never make you feel small for having boundaries. Loneliness versus being alone. One of John's biggest fears before that date was the idea of growing old alone. Society often paints a grim picture of solitude, especially for seniors. But John discovered that being alone doesn't mean being lonely. In fact, some of the loneliest people are in relationships where they feel unseen, unheard, and unappreciated. He found comfort in his own company, morning walks without small talk, in books that didn't judge, and in sunsets that didn't require validation. He realized that peaceful solitude is far better than chaotic companionship. It's not about having someone to sit across the table from you. It's about feeling whole, even when you're sitting alone. A message to others. If John could offer advice to anyone afraid of walking away, he'd say this: don't be afraid to choose yourself. The right people will respect your boundaries, and the wrong ones will test them. Walking away isn't a failure. It's a Victoria declaration that you know your worth. And sometimes, the best relationship you'll ever have is the one you build with yourself. In the end, John's blind date wasn't a romantic success, but it was a personal triumph. And that's a story worth telling. John's blind date with the 52-year-old woman wasn't just an awkward even, it became a pivotal moment that reshaped his understanding of relationships, self-respect, and the art of setting boundaries. It's fascinating how a seemingly ordinary event can hold profound life lessons, hidden beneath the surface of small talk, unmet expectations, and uncomfortable conversations. Not every story needs a happy ending to teach a valuable lesson. We often believe that every story, especially those about relationships, should end with romance, mutual understanding, or at least a friendly goodbye. But real life isn't always wrapped in neat conclusions. Sometimes, the best endings are the ones where you walk away. No drama, no prolonged explanations, just a simple realization that your time, energy, and peace matter more than forcing a connection that doesn't feel right. John didn't get a second date, but he got something far more valuable: a renewed sense of clarity. He learned that compatibility isn't just about shared interests or similar life goals. It's about respect, mutual understanding, and the ability to be yourself without feeling judged or pressured to meet unrealistic expectations. The power of self-reflection. After that night, John spent time reflecting on his past relationships. He realized how often he had ignored red flags in the name of being polite or giving things a chance. But here's the truth. You don't need to tolerate discomfort just to seem kind. True kindness includes being kind to yourself. He thought about how many times he'd stayed in situations, friendships, jobs, relationships long after they'd stopped serving him, all because he didn't want to be seen as difficult or ungrateful. But life isn't about enduring, it's about thriving. And thriving begins when you choose yourself, even if it means disappointing others. The unspoken lesson. Life is too short for the wrong people. When you're young, you might tolerate more. You might think, I can change them, or maybe it'll get better. But as you grow older, time feels more precious. You start to realize that every minute spent with the wrong people is a minute stolen from your own happiness. John's story isn't just about a bad date. It's about the courage to recognize when something or someone isn't right for you. It's about understanding that walking away doesn't mean you've failed. It means you've succeeded in honoring your own worth. A gentle reminder for you. If you're reading this and you've ever felt stuck in a situation that didn't feel right, remember this.